Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The most popular viewing in India, I suspect, will be the press briefing by the MEA spokesperson Arindam Bagchi. This briefing, however, marked a very interesting turning point in India's foreign relations. Because if I may put it simply, not simplistically, maybe a little bit simplistically, but simply what this briefing meant today was that Canada has become the new Pakistan in the Indian worldview. New Pakistan to the extent that Canada has now become not a state sponsor of terrorism that India has been calling Pakistan, but much else. For example, see the language that India has officially used about Canada. Now, I'm neither endorsing nor questioning anything. That is not the spirit of cut the clutter. I have my opinion, and you will see my opinion, I think, in this week's National Interest that will be published on Saturday morning. However, for now, let's just look at the language used, because that tells you how low India-Canada relations have fallen from a point when the two countries were seeing each other as strategic partners, because those agreements were made under the earlier Prime Minister in Canada, under Stephen Harper, who was a conservative leader. So now the language used about Canada is, and you know, I'm not talking lightly when I say that Canada seems to have become the new Pakistan for India, or in the official Indian view. Look at the language. Canada is a safe haven for terrorists, extremists, and organized crime. I'm not even sure if these three descriptions have ever been used even for Pakistan. Terrorists, extremists, but organized crime. That's because Punjab has a lot of gangsters now, gangsters who carry out hits, who carry out blackmailing, kidnappings, and who give orders from far away. Some of them even sit in Indian jails and give orders from there and run their empires from there. But some of them, according to Indian government, and these details apparently have been given to the Canadian authorities, or so Government of India says, they carry out their activities from Canada. So in Canada's case, there is Pakistan +1. So Pakistan is terrorism and extremism. In case of Canada, it's also organized crime. Now this also came in response to a question by a journalist who said, should India worry about its international reputation, given that one major country, in fact a G7 country, a member of NATO, a member also of the Five Eyes Alliance, that has made allegations. So that has said that they have, and I will use this very carefully and very accurately, they have credible allegations of Indian agents possibly being involved, or potentially being involved, I think that was the word used, in the killing of Nijjar. Now, the question was, should India worry about its international reputation? The MEA spokesperson, the spokesperson of the MEA speaks, Government of India speaks, MEA spokesperson said, the country that needs to worry about its reputation, and I quote him, and I think that country that needs to worry about its international reputation is Canada. He said, this is really harsh language. I don't remember India having used such harsh language about any G7 country, particularly a country which strategically has been seen to be an ally, or at least is a key ally of those countries with which India has a close strategic partnership. Then the MEA went on to say that Canada has created, it's responsible for the creation of an environment that disrupts the functioning of Indian High Commission and consulates in Canada. It says there is threat to Indian diplomats. This threat is open. There are posters being put. There are posters being put. There are hoardings being put. with pictures of Indian High Commissioner, Deputy High Commissioner, other key officials, basically marking them out as targets. So this is the language used about Canada. Then look at some other substantive action, because this relationship has really taken a turn for the worse, almost in the same way, and I will explain to you why I say so, almost in the same way as it has sometimes gone between India and Pakistan. Because now government of India has said that because there is so much interference and because it's so difficult for our consulates and our High Commission to function because of these threats and interruptions and threats and a bad environment, a hostile environment, a disruptive environment, that visa operations in Indian missions, Indian High Commission and consulates are now being suspended. That is a big setback for the large community of Indians who live in Canada, Indians who hold Canadian passports, because to come to India, they need visas. Of course, the spokesperson went on to say that this will not affect those who have OCI cards, etc., etc. But I suspect and I hear that soon enough there's going to be quite a bit of activity on OCI cards, suspensions, or maybe a more discreet listing of those who can come in and those who cannot come in, because this is going to get much worse before it gets better. At least that's my assessment. Then it even says that not only will we stop issuing visas for foreign citizens, Indian students there, for example, don't need visa, so they can keep traveling. But not only will they suspend visa operations or visa issue operations at Indian missions in Canada, but even Canadian citizens who apply for Indian visas in third countries. So, say Mr. Barjinder Singh, Harjinder Singh, Manjeet Singh, Ved Prakash, Goyal, Shah, anybody holding a Canadian passport applies for a visa for India from London or say from Helsinki or Rome, etc. Those visas will also not be granted. That means Canadian passports will not be granted visas in the normal course from now. Then he went on to say the safe haven is being provided by Canada. We want Canadian government to not do so and take action against those who have terrorism charges against them, or send them to us, send them to India to face justice. And then this really was a case of jumping the shark. I'm using an American expression. Again, the spokesperson went on to say, and I quote again, there is Canadian diplomatic interference in our internal affairs. So I wasn't exaggerating when I said this is almost beginning to sound like an India-Pakistan exchange. And then he went on to say that in our assessment, there is a disparity. There is a disparity of numbers, of strength, and there is a disparity of rank in the strength of our High Commission, our diplomatic missions in Canada, and Canada's diplomatic missions and High Commission and consulates in India. So India has asked Canada to pare their strength down so that a parity can be brought about. That means a lot of Canadian diplomats and staff have to leave India now. This stuff has been happening between India and Pakistan. That's why I said I'm not exaggerating when I draw that comparison. Canada, on the other hand, has done what any country would do diplomatically to cover for itself. All countries do it. They've said that they might have to withdraw some of their diplomats because they don't feel safe here. They've seen social media threats. My only one little point of addition there would be that there might be social media threats because people on Twitter, people on Facebook, Instagram, I don't know what else do they use these days, may be doing it. Maybe some are credible threats, maybe some are not credible threats, maybe some are plain trolls or whatever. But this can be disconcerting. Nobody who represents their country in a foreign country wants to face any threats of any kind, because under Vienna Convention, any diplomat working in another country has the full protection. And if you're representing your country as a diplomat in another country, the last thing you want is your life, normal life, to be disrupted by these threats. These can be very disconcerting. But look at the picture from the other end. And one doesn't justify the other. But Indian diplomats in Canada are facing not just social media threats. They are facing real threats with their pictures put on these hoardings. See this hoarding. This is outside the Gurdwara that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was the head of. Not just that, Indian missions have been attacked. Indian consulate has been attacked. Indian consulate in San Francisco, not in Canada, but again by the same forces, by the same Sikh radical forces, were almost overrun. Parts of it were damaged. Americans took action. India has today issued a list of 10 suspects because they've now identified these faces, or they've taken these pictures from CCTV cameras from that attack in San Francisco. So India has issued these pictures and details, also asking people for the whereabouts and details of these people. So India's up the ante. So if Canadian diplomats in India feel disconcerted by social media threats, which is a terrible thing, they should not face, no diplomat should face any threats anywhere. Also think about Indian diplomats, poor Indian diplomats who face more direct threats in Canada. So that is the level to which the relationship has fallen right now. There was much else said today. For example, the spokesperson also said that Canada has asked us for cooperation in Nijjar's killing. We are willing to cooperate, but Canada has given us no specific inputs. He also went on to say, look, we are willing to cooperate, but the fact is that whenever we have asked Canada to cooperate with us in cases of radicalism, terrorism in India, Canadians have never cooperated. This is a tit-for-tat language. Then he says that unlike Canada, which has given us no evidence as yet, India has given Canada a lot of evidence about terrorist activity or extremist activity in Canada. And again, responding to Canada's allegations or suspicions on India and Indian diplomats, he said, and I quote, there is a degree of prejudice in what they've been saying, and these allegations by Canada are primarily politically driven. So this is where the relationship is. But the fact is that relationship was not always like that. India-Canada relationship actually began very well. If I take you to the Canadian government website talking about their international affairs, they define Canada's relationship with India as and I quote, long-standing bilateral relationship built upon shared traditions of democracy, etc., etc., etc. So the beginning was pretty good because in the late 40s and later in the 50s, Canadian Prime Ministers then, Louis St. Laurent and Lester Pearson, they were very friendly with Jawaharlal Nehru. So Jawaharlal Nehru actually in 1949, 24th October 1949, addressed the joint session of Canadian Parliament. Later, Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi in 1973, that is 19 June 1973, addressed the joint session of Canadian Parliament. So even though there was the Cold War and India was seen as friendly or maybe even an ally of the Soviet Union, and the relationship between India and America was often fraught, India-Canada relationship was not that negative. In fact, for many decades, India continued to be the largest recipient of Canadian foreign aid under the Colombo Plan. It's in 2006 when Dr. Manmohan Singh's government changed India's policy on foreign aid. In 2006, 15 years after economic reform had begun, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government said India shall accept no foreign aid because India does not need any foreign aid. And in fact, if you go to this Canadian government website, they also confirm this. They also say that in 2006, India's policy on foreign aid changed. Now, India's policy on foreign aid changed, but something else changed in Canada. I will come to that. But before that, I will tell you what happened before that. There were a bunch of setbacks to India-Canada relationship, and I will count three. One was 1974. 1974 was when the first Pokhran test took place. When the first Pokhran test took place, Mrs. Gandhi tested a nuclear device in Pokhran. She called it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Obviously, nobody bought that explanation. There is no such thing as a peaceful nuclear explosion. The Canadians knew and the world knew, and in fact, it's not a secret, it was never a secret, that the plutonium that India used for that explosion, that had been taken out. You can call it by stealth because this was a reactor set up with Canadian help. This was the CYRUS reactor. CYRUS stands for Canada India Reactor Utilities Services. Interesting acronym for a very boring name. Canada India Reactor Utilities Services. This was the second reactor set up in India. The first Apsara was much smaller. This one was also a small reactor, 40 megawatt. was supposed to be a research reactor, but even a 40 megawatt reactor could produce about 6 to 7 kilos of plutonium every year. And obviously, India had been parking some of it on the side because the idea was one day to build a nuclear weapon or nuclear deterrence. So plutonium from this reactor was used, and this reactor, when the Canadian built it in India, they put many conditions, including that researchers from many other developing countries will be allowed to come and learn and research at this reactor. The important thing is when this reactor was set up in the mid 1950s, by that time IAEA safeguards had not yet come in. So inspections were not yet taking place. So it's not as if India stole this plutonium under the eye of the IAEA inspectors. This was pre the inspection regime. But the fact is that there was an India-Canada accord which Canadians thought that India violated. So Canada then stopped all nuclear cooperation with India for a long time and stopped supplying uranium to India, which shut down some of India's most important nuclear plants. For example, the Rajasthan Atomic Power Plant, the first unit that was to use Canadian uranium, that went through many crises. And those days there used to be headlines in newspapers saying Tarapur is now shutting down because it has no uranium. Rajasthan Atomic Power Station, RAPS 1, then later 2 at Rawat Bhata in Rajasthan near Kota, that shutting down because there is no uranium. Those headlines became common. That uranium resupply from Canada actually began 36 years later, and I will come to that as well as to how that happened, when that happened in 2015, because much happened between 1974 and then. So 1974, Canada cut India off from many things. Then things began to improve a little bit in the mid 80s, but before that a terrible thing had happened. In early 80s, India noted and reminded the Canadians repeatedly. In fact, Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, told Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, who was Prime Minister of Canada, not for one, but for 3 terms. He was Prime Minister between 1968 and 1979 and Prime Minister again between 1980 and 1984. So she told him in 1982 that there were really bad dark forces, Sikh radical forces growing in Canada, and he was not keeping an eye on them, and he was not paying attention to the threat that was arising. Like son, like father, or like father, like son. The father paid no attention, and as a result of that complacency, in 1985, Air India Kanishka was blown up. That is a terrible terror incident that we've spoken about in great detail in earlier episodes of Cut the Clutter, so I'm not going there. So 1985, Kanishka blew up. In fact, at that point, in fact, until 9/11, it was the largest single act of international terrorism in the entire world. And remember, the bombers had planned to simultaneously blow up not one jumbo jet, Air India jumbo jet, but 2 Air India jumbo jets, because another jumbo jet, there was another suitcase with a bomb heading for another jumbo jet to take off from Narita in Tokyo. It just so happened that the genius who rigged these bombs did not realize that Japan did not follow daylight saving time. So that bomb and that suitcase blew up while it was still on the baggage belt, killing 2 baggage handlers, but the aircraft got saved. Otherwise, 2 full jumbos would have blown up in mid-air. That would have been, imagine the kind of tragedy that would have been. It was a Canadian tragedy. That bombing became an albatross in the neck of India-Canada relations. The important thing, however, is that at that point, by that time, in 1984, Conservatives had taken power in Canada. So Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, and obviously his responses to this terror attack, this terrible terror attack, were much more honest and much more forward-looking, and he reached out to India. So he and Rajiv Gandhi established a good rapport, as a result of which in 1987 the 2 countries signed their extradition treaty. Now, not only did they sign their extradition treaty, they also started some other bilateral activity. For example, they started a process whereby our security people and Canadian security people would meet again work on counter-terror. Going ahead, these developed into other organizations, robust organizations. For example, there was an India-Canada strategic dialogue that was initiated, and later in 1997, a Canada-India working group on counter-terrorism was set up. This happened when Lloyd Axworthy, the Canadian Foreign Minister, visited India a year earlier in 1996. Jean Chrétien, who was by now the Prime Minister, although he was from the Liberal Party, but he came to India. Remember, India was changing because of economic reform and was seen as an attractive destination. So he came in, he made brave statements as Canada was back in India and it was here to stay. And that's when, besides other things, the decision to set up a consulate in Chandigarh was taken, and also the first Four Seasons hotel in India based on Canadian investments also came at that time. It was then that in 1997 this Canada-India working group on counter-terrorism was set up. And then just after that in 1998, India carried out the second nuclear test, and this time said these are nuclear weapons. So you had the overhang of 1974, because of which Canadian uranium sales to India were already banned. Then you had, after that, 1985, the Kanishka crash, because of which a big distrust developed between India and Canada. And now 1998, and once again, when Americans take action against another foreign country, Canadians usually are even keener than the Americans. So a pattern has been established now. America and Canada are close allies. When Americans take action against another foreign country, usually Canadians will take even stronger action with great alacrity. But when Americans withdraw from that action and Americans normalize the relationship, Canadians also do so, but after a lag. So in 1993, the Canadians came to India, maybe after a couple of years after the Americans had opened out to India. Once again, after 1998, after the second nuclear tests, Americans normalized their relationship with India within 2 years. These were the Stroop, Talbot, Jaswant Singh talks. Whereas the Canadians took another couple of years longer. So 2003, Jean Chrétien again came to India. But yet again, the real improvement in the relationship started when Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party took power in 2006. And remember, I told you, I'll tell you something about Kanishka bombing. 1985, the Kanishka bombing took place. 2006 it was, after Stephen Harper came to power, that Canadian government, that his government set up a judicial inquiry into what had happened. 21 years after that horrible tragedy, Canadian government did it. And for this to happen, a conservative had to come to power in Canada. Those 10 years under Stephen Harper with Dr. Manmohan Singh on this side completely revolutionized, completely changed India-Canadian relations. And it was during that period, as part of that process, that 2015, even though by that time Trudeau had come to power, by 2015, India received its first shipment of Canadian uranium. Canada, by the way, produces 13% of the world's uranium. India received its first shipment of Canadian uranium in 36 years in 2015. And it's important to review what happened under Stephen Harper. In 2010, India and Canada signed their civil nuclear deal. 3 years after India and the US had signed their civil nuclear deal. I told you that when US opens out to a country, Canadians follow, but about a couple of years lag. In this case, about 2.5 years lag. And while signing the civil nuclear deal, Stephen Harper then said that India-Canada relationship no longer lives in the past of the 1970s. Canada is a democracy, a robust democracy. So Stephen Harper lost power. Justin Trudeau came in. And Manmohan Singh lost power. And Narendra Modi came into power in India. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi made an early visit to Canada. It was a good visit in 2015. But shortly after that, things began to foul up. And maybe things began to foul up because somebody didn't like the fact that India and Canada, particularly when India was under the BJP, which is a party of the nationalist right, and Canada was under Justin Trudeau, which is a party of the liberal left, the two countries were warming up to each other or building on the relationship, building on the foundation that was that was laid under Stephen Harper and Manmohan Singh, that the House of the State of Ontario, the State Assembly of the State of Ontario in Canada, passed a resolution declaring the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi to be a genocide. When that happened, that immediately was a setback to India-Canada relations. From that setback, the relations haven't recovered yet. Not just that, relations have been going downwards, barring one joint statement in 2018 where both countries acknowledged the threat from radical Sikh extremists. Besides that, relationship has gone downhill, and from 2009 onwards, it's gone steeply downhill. And what happens when something goes downhill? You know, when a heavy object travels downhill, the more it travels, the more momentum it gathers. And that's exactly what's happened with India-Canada relationship now. If you see what's been said at today's briefing, what Government of India has now said, the responses from Canada, you can see that this relationship now is in free fall.